Thank you, Mark. Einmal habe ich eigentlich fließend Deutsch gesprochen vor 30 Jahren und aber leider nicht mehr. Maybe in my previous life I must have been German, aber seit 30 Jahren habe ich fast nie Deutsch gesprochen. Englisch ist bestimmt besser als mein Deutsch. So yeah, thank you, Mark. Thank you for inviting me. It's great to be here. I've heard a lot about this fantastic institute, so it's great to be here in person. I've read a lot of the papers that have emerged from this institute, and yeah, as far as I can see, it's one of the central places in the world which is doing research on psi experiences, altered states of consciousness, and so forth. So it has a very important role. I'm going to speak about, for the past 15 years, maybe 17 years now, I've been doing research on spiritual awakening, mainly outside the context of spiritual traditions. So I'm going to try to summarize 15 years of research in 45 minutes. It's a challenge, but hopefully it will work out okay. But as with many people, my interest in this area emerged from my own experiences. When I was a teenager, I was like many teenagers, I was in a state of depression, turbulence, confusion. Every so often, maybe every 2 weeks or so, I would have an unusual experience. Then they were always very similar. Usually when I was walking in natural surroundings, maybe in the park or through the countryside, I would shift into a different state of consciousness, and everything around me would take on a new perspective, a new reality. All of my surroundings would seem to come to life, to be incredibly beautiful. Trees would seem to become sentient beings. Everything became alive and beautiful, and everything became interconnected. I had this feeling that beneath the superficial reality of the world, there was something deeper, a kind of force or energy that brought things into oneness. But I didn't have a religious background. My parents were not religious. I didn't know anything about spirituality. And when I had these feelings, they were feelings of euphoria, harmony, an intense sense of connection between me and the world. I didn't know how to make sense of these experiences. I thought they meant I was crazy. I felt quite crazy already, but these experiences, I think, oh yeah, I must be crazy. There's no way that I can understand these experiences. Nobody talked about these experiences. I didn't dream of talking to my parents about them because they already thought I was crazy. They would have sent me to see a psychiatrist, I'm sure. So luckily, I didn't tell my parents about them. So for a long time, for maybe 5 or 6 years, I was quite confused about these experiences, and they made me feel like I couldn't fit into the world. I couldn't be a normal person because I had these experiences. But when I was maybe 22, I think I was 22 years old, I found a book. It was called Mysticism, a Study and an Anthology by an English scholar of mysticism called F.C. Happold, Frederick Happold. And I felt instinctively attracted to the book. And when I took it home, I realized, wow, these are similar to the experiences I've been having. Maybe I'm not crazy after all, because lots of other people have had similar experiences. Or maybe I am crazy, but lots of other people are crazy too. So I'm not alone in my craziness. So it was my first glimpse into the world of spirituality and mysticism. So after that, I obsessively explored the world of spirituality and mysticism. I went to talks about Buddhism, about the Kabbalah. I learned to meditate. I learned to do yoga. So at last I had a framework to make sense of my own experiences. I realized that I was having what are traditionally called spiritual experiences or mystical experiences. So years later, back then I was a musician. That's what brought me to Germany. I was a musician in Germany for a couple of years. But later on, when I decided to return to academia, I wanted to study these experiences. And I learned that there was a field called transpersonal psychology. And when I learned about transpersonal psychology, I thought, wow, yeah, this is exactly what I want to do. This is exactly where I fit. Transpersonal psychology, as some of you probably know, is the area of psychology which investigates spirituality. It's kind of where Eastern spiritual traditions merge with Western psychology. That is transpersonal psychology. So I became involved in the field of transpersonal psychology. I did a PhD in transpersonal psychology. And the main focus of my research was what I call awakening experiences. So spirituality or spiritual awakening is one of those terms which is quite difficult to define. Many people have a different vision of what it actually means, but this is how I understand spiritual awakening. Quite simple, really. I understand spiritual awakening simply as an intensification and expansion of awareness. You could use that in a general sense. It's an expansion and intensification of awareness. But I specify 4 domains in which awareness expands. First of all, there is an expansion of perceptual awareness. That simply means that the world around us becomes more beautiful, more real, more vivid. It's almost as if a veil of familiarity falls away, and we suddenly have access to this brighter, more vivid world. It's a bit like returning to the intense perception of young children before our perception has become filtered by concepts and labels and language. So we're suddenly, in spiritual awakening, the world is much more real. It becomes much more fascinating, much more beautiful, and there's a sense of appreciation. Many people who undergo spiritual awakening speak about a sense of connection to nature, or a new sense of the beauty of nature, a new awareness of the beauty of nature. Also, there is an intensification of subjective awareness. That means that we become aware of new dimensions of our own being. We become aware of energies and potentials inside us. Our being seems to become deeper and wider. It's a bit like, imagine that you're living in a tiny room and you never go outside the room. And then suddenly a door opens and you walk through the door and you realize that you're actually living in a gigantic house with many floors, many levels, many rooms, gardens, etc. So your being becomes much more expansive, much wider. Also, there is an expansion of intersubjective awareness, which means that we connect to other beings more deeply. We connect to other human beings in empathy, compassion. We feel other people's experiences more strongly, which is why spirituality is traditionally associated with compassion, empathy, and altruism. And not just other human beings, but other living beings, animals, other species, and the whole of the natural world. We connect more strongly with the whole of nature. That's why many spiritual traditions or many spiritual teachers speak about a transcendence of separation. You know, the idea that we are entities living inside our own personal space and our own bodies, that fades away. Our being seems to expand and to connect with other beings. Finally, there is an expansion of conceptual awareness. By that, I mean that there is a wider vision of reality. We no longer see the world from an egocentric perspective, in which our own desires are most important, more important than other people's well-being. In spiritual awakening, we have a much more wide-ranging vision. You could say a world-centric perspective rather than an egocentric, or maybe even a cosmocentric perspective. There's this really wide cosmological vision of reality. So the focus of our awareness is no longer our own ambitions or desires. It's the well-being of other human beings, the well-being of the world itself, the well-being of the whole universe itself. That also involves a transcendence of group identity. In the normal human state, many people have a sense of group identity, in terms of a national identity, social or ethnic identity. It could be an identity as a football fan, identifying as a, as a follower of a certain football club. But in spiritual awakening, there's a transcendence of any group identity, any sense of national identity or ethnic identity. If there is any identity at all, it is as a member of the human race, with a feeling of kinship with all other human beings, even if they belong to different nations or different groups. So spiritual awakening can manifest itself on a temporary basis in the form of what I call an awakening experience. So you can think of this as a temporary expansion of awareness. Maybe it lasts for 2 seconds, maybe 2 minutes, maybe 2 hours, maybe 2 days if you are lucky. But there's always, at some point, there's always a return to normal awareness. You experience this expansion of awareness. You have a glimpse of a wider reality, a more beautiful and meaningful world. And then your awareness contracts again, and you return to your normal state of awareness. And awakening experiences are quite common. What is less common is when, sorry, remember, I have to stand still. And what is less common is when wakefulness becomes permanent or ongoing, when it becomes established as a normal ongoing trait. That's more unusual, but not completely uncommon. I always think that there are many more cases than we are aware of. A lot of people who experience wakefulness do not have a background in traditional spirituality. They would not explain their state in these terms, but nevertheless they experience it as their normal state. So this is how I define wakefulness: an expansive, higher functioning and stable state of being in which a person's vision of and relationship to the world are transformed, along with their subjective experience, their sense of identity, and their conceptual outlook. So wakefulness is essentially the same as an awakening experience, but established on an ongoing basis. And because it's more stable and ongoing, there are slightly different aspects which manifest themselves, but essentially it's the same state. Many people think that it's not possible to live in a permanent state of wakefulness, because we have to drive cars, we have to pay bills, we have to do the washing up and so forth. So, how could we do these things if we were in a permanent state of enlightenment? Surely enlightened people can't drive cars. It would be too dangerous. Imagine having a sense of the oneness of the whole universe while driving on the Autobahn. No, but the important point is that even though these traits are stable, they don't always express themselves. Awakened people can still focus their attention when necessary. They can still do practical things when necessary, but when they relax, when they don't have to focus, then they can return to the experience of oneness or inner well-being, etc. So it is possible to live in an ongoing state of wakefulness. But as I mentioned already, my perspective is not linked to any particular spiritual tradition. Maybe because I don't have any particular spiritual or religious background myself. Maybe if I'd had a spiritual background, a Christian background, maybe I would focus on Christian mysticism. But my perspective, you could say it's psychological rather than spiritual or religious. There are many different spiritual traditions which I admire. I particularly admire Buddhism, Hindu Vedanta, Taoism, many others. But I think of all spiritual traditions as offering a particular perspective. They are like windows onto a landscape of expansive human experience. So every window has a different view, a different perspective. And everybody from different traditions explores the landscape in a different way. They see different things. They have a different perspective. So they describe it in slightly different ways. But they are all valid. But I think it is also possible to describe this landscape without any particular spiritual perspective. You can experience this landscape without any affiliation to a spiritual tradition. So I think this landscape I refer to it as a landscape of expansive human experience. It pre-exists any spiritual tradition. It exists outside any particular spiritual tradition. And obviously, many spiritual traditions offer guidance in exploring this landscape. They have a very important role in providing a framework to understand this landscape. But as I say, it doesn't have to be explored in those terms. This is just an overview of the ways in which some spiritual traditions describe awakening experiences. Most spiritual traditions make a distinction between temporary experiences of awakening and an ongoing experience of awakening. So in Hinduism, we have different forms of samadhi as a temporary experience: savikalpa samadhi, nirvikalpa samadhi. They are temporary experiences. But samadhi can also be an ongoing experience as sahaja samadhi, which is when samadhi is integrated into everyday life. It's an ongoing experience of union and bliss. In the Sufi tradition, there's a similar distinction between fana, which is usually seen as a temporary experience of annihilation or forgetfulness of the self, and baka, which is usually seen as an ongoing experience of abiding in God or being one with God. In Christian mysticism, there's the same distinction between mystical experiences, which are temporary, and an ongoing process or an ongoing state of oneness with God, which is described as theosis or deification. Taoism, I couldn't find a term for temporary awakening experiences in Taoism, but Taoism has a concept of Ming, which is a state of harmony or oneness with the Tao, when our lives become the expression of Tao. So that is equivalent to wakefulness, I would say. Abraham Maslow, who many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with, the American psychologist, he spoke in a similar way about peak experiences, which are temporary, and plateau experiences, which are ongoing and stable. And that's similar to my concept of awakening experiences and wakefulness. So all of these, every spiritual tradition has an ideal state which followers or adepts aim for. All spiritual traditions have a goal, a final goal of development, which is usually described as a state of union with reality, a state of self-realization, enlightenment, to use the Buddhist term. But in my view, these terms are equivalent. They are similar. They are windows onto the same landscape of expansive experience. That's why I am you could call me a perennialist. There's been a debate in religious studies for a long time about the perennial philosophy, about whether spiritual and mystical traditions share the same principles and the same goals. And I think every spiritual or mystical tradition flows from the same experiences of oneness, the same heightened experiences of reality. So they all describe it slightly differently from their different perspectives, but essentially it's the same experience. So let me tell you briefly about my research on awakening experiences. Hmm. In fact, let me ask you a question. This is the question I used in my research. Have you ever had an awakening experience in which your awareness of reality has intensified and expanded? Anybody familiar with that type of experience? Hmm. I describe it in more detail. This could be an experience in which your surroundings have become more real and beautiful. Perhaps you felt, excuse me, a sense of connection to them and a deep sense of inner well-being. Perhaps you have felt a sense of harmony and meaning pervade the world, a sense that all things are one. The experience may have left you with a sense that life is more meaningful. So yeah, some of you have had that experience. Hmm. This is the type of experience I had when I was a teenager, as I described earlier. So when I began my research, I wanted to find out, first of all, how common these experiences were, but I was especially interested in the triggers of these experiences. I was interested in finding out the different situations or activities which give rise to these experiences. And just let me give you a couple of simple examples of these experiences. This is what I would class, this is what I would call a low intensity awakening experience. And probably not, these particular experiences are probably not uncommon. Maybe you've had this type of experience. This is a woman who was swimming in a lake, and this is how she described her experience. I swam out as far as I could to the middle of the lake and just looked around, treading water. I could see no houses, no people, no cars or roads. I felt completely alone, but part of everything. I felt at peace. All my troubles disappeared, and I felt in harmony with nature. It only lasted for a few minutes, but I remember the sense of calmness and stillness, and it soothes me now. So here there was a sense of oneness with her surroundings, a sense of inner well-being, a sense of transcending anxiety, and a feeling of harmony with nature. And these experiences, as I said before, they are normally quite brief, maybe a few seconds or a few minutes, but they have a long lasting impact, maybe a life-changing impact. And as I say, these experiences exist on a continuum. This is what I would call a low intensity awakening experience. These two examples are what I would call a high intensity awakening experience. The first one happened when the person was a child. He was maybe 4 or 5 years old. He was living in Scotland, and one day he ran out of his house to play with his friends. And suddenly, as soon as he walked outside his door, everything shifted. This is how he described it. I looked at the telegraph pole outside of my friend's house, 4 doors up. It was pulsating with life and energy. The road surface was the same. I was made up of the same pulsating energy. I lay down, looked up to the sky, and just felt the oneness of everything, felt the earth spinning in its orbit. I seemed to understand or know that everything is freshly created in every moment. This is an amazing experience for a child of 4 or 5 years old. It's as if he was seeing the fundamental reality of the universe, the fundamental spiritual force behind all phenomena. But he made the mistake of telling his parents about the experience. And he had a few similar experiences. His parents naturally thought there was something wrong with him, and they referred him to a psychiatrist. So it was quite this experience. It illustrates the possibility of pathologizing spiritual awakening experiences. And it illustrates, I tell my students at university, if you have this kind of experience, don't tell your parents about it, unless they are spiritual people who are familiar with these experiences. The second experience illustrates the connection between awakening experiences and psychological turmoil. So this was a young woman who was suffering from severe depression. She had attempted suicide. She was recovering in hospital. And one day, well, she woke up one morning in hospital and there was a marble. This is a marble on her bedside table in hospital. She had no idea where this marble had come from, but she picked up the marble and this is how she described it. She saw the marble as a symbol of oneness. And she said, I saw reality as simply this perfect oneness. I felt suddenly removed from everything that was personal. Everything seemed just right. All my problems and my suffering suddenly seemed meaningless. There was a feeling of acceptance and oneness. The euphoria and inexplicable rush of knowledge and understanding following this episode lasted for days. So this is also what I would call a high intensity awakening experience, the equivalent to mystical experiences. You know, if you look into textbooks of mystical experience, they describe similar experiences, but usually interpreted in a religious context in terms of God or a divine force that pervades the world. And after this experience, there is a positive story in relation to this experience. After this experience, the woman began to recover from depression. As a result of the experience, she had a more positive outlook on life. She had a sense of meaning and an optimism. So it was, for her, it was a very therapeutic, healing experience. So, as I said, one of the main aims of my research was to investigate the triggers of these experiences, the contexts in which they occur. These are some of the significant triggers of awakening experiences: contact with nature, as in the first experience we saw, spiritual practice, watching or listening to an arts performance, psychological turmoil, psychedelics, love stroke sexual experiences. In our research, we collected many reports of awakening experiences, and we conducted a thematic analysis of the reports to find out the contexts and situations in which the experiences occurred. What do you think? In this list of triggers, what do you think would be the most common trigger of these experiences? Any ideas? Nature? Yeah, nature. Any others? Psychedelics, possibly. Yeah, I mean, you could think about your own personal experiences too. You know, in your own life, which triggers have been associated with your experiences? Nature, meditation. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Any others based on your personal experience? Art performances. Yeah, you, for example. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, music is certainly strongly associated with combination. Yeah. Yeah. So that's what it really means. Yeah. Ah. Sex and drugs and rock and roll. Precisely. Enduring. Yeah. Yeah. That's why I was in a band. Yeah. Any other based on personal experience? Well, this is what we found in one of our research studies. We studied 91 reports of awakening experiences with a thematic analysis. And we found that the strongest trigger was psychological turmoil. Some experiences had more than one trigger, but psychological turmoil was associated with 37 out of 91, so around 40%, quite a high proportion. And then contact with nature was the second most prevalent trigger. Then spiritual practice, such as meditation. We also found that spiritual literature was a powerful trigger, a significant trigger, reading spiritual books. And also, well, those were the main triggers. There were four main triggers. There were some minor triggers: love, stroke, sex, watching or listening to an arts performance, and psychedelics. You'd maybe expect psychedelics to be more prevalent, but our sample was from the general population rather than from a group of people like you. So now, you know, amongst the general population, not so many people have taken psychedelics. So that's probably why it doesn't come up strongly. There is quite a strong association between love, stroke, sex. I mean, sexual experiences are obviously very intimate, so people are probably reluctant to share them. So maybe in reality, sexual experiences would be more prevalent. Particularly sexual experiences are sometimes associated with Kundalini type experiences, when an explosive energy rises through the body and changes our perception of reality. Like many people who write about time perception, I have no sense of time. Mark, that's another example. Joking. But yeah, I've already sort of misestimated my timings. So I'm going to move on to another topic now. I'm going to move on to ongoing wakefulness now, and summarize some of my research into ongoing wakefulness. As I say, ongoing wakefulness is less common than a temporary awakening experience, but there are certainly many cases that I've investigated. I've interviewed more than 100 people who experience ongoing wakefulness. Not only I've interviewed some spiritual teachers and spiritual authors, but mostly general members of the public who have experienced a shift into an ongoing wakeful state. But ongoing wakefulness can arise in three different ways. It can be natural, when a person doesn't need to meditate, they don't need to undergo a sudden transformational experience. They are just naturally awakened. It's just their normal state. This is very, very unusual, but there are some cases. There are, and people who are naturally awakened tend to be artists, poets, musicians, painters. If you think about the great romantic poets, in England, we have people like William Blake, William Wordsworth, Shelley. Here in Germany, maybe Goethe, Hölderlin. I'm thinking of people like that, people who felt strongly connected to nature, who felt that nature was alive with some sort of spiritual force. And I would also painters like in England, Turner, maybe Caspar David Friedrich, perhaps here in Germany, maybe Monet in France. People with a heightened perception, people who experienced a heightened intensity of perception and described it in their poetry or their paintings. I think we're speaking about naturally awakened people. Some naturally awakened people become social activists. There's quite a strong connection between wakefulness and social activism. Many of the great social activists in human history, like Gandhi, Martin Luther King, they were spiritually awakened people, at least to some degree. But the most common way in which wakefulness arises is when it's gradual. There are millions of people around the world who follow some path of personal development, some form of spiritual practice. And everybody who follows some form of spiritual practice, you can say that they're moving, however slowly, however gradually, towards wakefulness. They're undergoing some form of personal development, moving them towards awakening. But wakefulness can also arise very suddenly and dramatically. And that's usually in the form of what I call transformation through turmoil. Transformation through turmoil occurs when people go through intense crises in their lives. It could be a diagnosis of cancer. It could be a bereavement, a long period of addiction or depression, intense stress. It doesn't really matter what type of turmoil or trauma, but it's a very intense period of prolonged trauma. So often in response to that, well, often is probably the wrong word, sometimes in response to that, people undergo a shift in identity, almost as if their normal identity collapses because of the stress and turmoil they're facing, like a house that collapses in an earthquake. Their identity collapses. They have a breakdown. But for some people, that breakdown becomes a shift up, you could say. There's a new identity inside them that arises. It's almost as if in some people there is a latent, spiritually awakened self, which is waiting for the opportunity to emerge. So when the normal identity breaks down, this latent, spiritually awakened self arises inside them. I'll just give you one brief example. This is a woman who I interviewed who was diagnosed with cancer. She was diagnosed with cancer and told that she maybe had 9 months left to live. But immediately after being diagnosed with cancer, she underwent an awakening. This is how she described her experience right after she was diagnosed with cancer. This is right after she emerged from the consulting room, after being told that she had 9 months left to live. She said, "It was the first time that I'd seen death as a reality and realized that life is just temporary. The following day, I woke up and thought, I'm just so lucky to be alive. The fact that I'm still here. The air was so clean and fresh, and everything I looked at seemed so vibrant and vivid. The trees were so green, and everything was so alive. I had a tremendous feeling of connectedness." At first, like many people who have this experience, she expected it to fade away, but it remained as a constant state. Luckily, her cancer went into remission, but she retained the heightened awareness that she had gained from her diagnosis. She said that feeling was really intense for the first few weeks, and it's remained ever since. I used to just sit and think, this is amazing that things could fall into place so quickly. So I interviewed her 13 years after this experience. So she still retained that heightened state of awareness. And her life had changed completely. She'd given up her previous job and retrained as a therapist to help other cancer patients. And she had a completely different perspective, a completely different outlook on reality. So I've spent a lot of time investigating what I call transformation through turmoil. And it manifests itself in lots of very strange ways. I've interviewed many cases of severe addicts who've lost everything due to their alcoholism or drug addiction. And when they reach rock bottom, when they're considering suicide, when they feel completely hopeless, occasionally they undergo this shift. A new identity seems to emerge inside them. And when this identity emerges, their addiction mysteriously disappears. They lose their craving for alcohol or drugs. And, it's almost miraculous. But I mean, the way I explain it is that this new identity which emerges, it's completely new, completely fresh, so it doesn't carry any addictions. The identity which carried the addiction has died. So this new self doesn't carry any addiction. Let me finish by briefly mentioning the inventory which Mark briefly described earlier. So once I had identified the characteristics of spiritual awakening, I worked together with other researchers who were working in similar areas. We combined our research to identify, specifically identify the characteristics associated with spiritual awakening. And with the help of Mark, and also Damisela Linares Gutierrez, she's not here today? No? And Sebastian Kubel, I think some of you know Sebastian? No? Yep. Oh yeah, okay. So sadly he couldn't be here today. But yeah, but we worked together to validate this inventory, initially the English version, then the German version. And this is the paper that we published last year, I think, in the Journal of Humanistic Psychology. Measuring an ongoing state of wakefulness, the development and validation of an inventory of secular and spiritual wakefulness. So I won't go into detail. We don't have too much time left, so I won't go into detail about how we constructed the scale. But initially it was based on interviews, over 100 interviews with spiritually awakened people. Then a thematic analysis to identify the common characteristics that people described. Then we created statements to describe the characteristics, which were analyzed by expert witnesses like David Lukoff, for example, Peter Fennick, who some of you may be aware of. So they helped us to validate the scale. And this is the German version of the scale. So you can briefly take a look to find out if you're spiritually awakened. 16 statements. So yeah, these statements describe the characteristics of spiritual awakening. No. We did, we compared this scale with other scales like the mindfulness inventory, the Freiburg mindfulness inventory, and other scales to find correlations. We found strong correlations between mindfulness and other characteristics. One of these statements is a reverse statement. Anybody spotted?
The last one.
The last one, yeah. Ich fühle mich unter Druck gesetzt. Yeah, that's a reverse statement. I think in the English version, there are 2 reverse statements, but the English version has 19 statements, but 3 of them did not translate very well. So we had to eliminate 3. But the scale works, even without the 3 statements from the English version, it still works very well. And yeah, as I said before, we found that the German version and the English version were both reliable, strong correlations with the mindfulness inventory, negative correlations with the big 5 neuroticism scale, subscale. Overall, we found that wakefulness is an identifiable psychological state, distinct from ordinary human awareness. In our research, we compared groups of awakened people with matched samples of the general population, and we found significant differences between them. We also found that, as I suggested before, that wakefulness is a continuum. There are degrees of wakefulness. And in the new study, which we've recently completed, where is this going to be published? I can't remember, Mark. Can you remember? So in this study, we compared a group of expert meditators with a matched sample of the general population. And again, we found a strong, significant difference on the wakefulness scale. So basically, there seems to be, this study seems to show a correlation between meditation and wakefulness. So that seems to be quite significant. And the scale, it's around 30 or 40 therapists and researchers have contacted me to ask permission to use the scale. So it's becoming widely used already. And there were lots of kind of exciting applications where we could apply the scale. It would be interesting to compare wakefulness and psi ability, for example. One would expect there to be a correlation between wakefulness and psi ability. but hopefully the scale could verify that. Perhaps there's a correlation between wakefulness and age. Some studies suggest that wakefulness increases with age, which is good news for any older people here. But yeah, so that'd be interesting. There seems to be, in some ways, life seems to be a natural process of spiritual development, life itself. So the older we grow, the more naturally spiritual we may become. Some people, anyway. And also things like psychedelics. It'd be useful to find out whether there was a correlation between wakefulness and the use of psychedelics, whether people who use psychedelics regularly have a higher than normal level of wakefulness. The only other point in relation to the scale is that when I shared on social media that we had created the scale, I don't know if you were aware of this, Mark, but I had quite a lot of negative reaction from spiritual seekers. They were saying, we don't want to turn spirituality into a competition. We don't want to measure our progress every week. They think, oh no, I'm not getting anywhere. And also people said, awakening is mysterious, it's formless. Why would we want to measure it? Don't we demean it somehow by trying to measure it? But I don't think that's true. I think many spiritual seekers like the idea that what they're experiencing or exploring is something transcendent and miraculous and mysterious. But actually, it's not. It's a natural psychological state that we should be able to explore and measure. So I think the scale will be helpful. It will also be helpful in enabling people to, there are so many gurus, so-called gurus around who pretend to be spiritually awakened and promote themselves as teachers, but actually are deluded or narcissistic individuals who cause a lot of damage and corruption. I get so disappointed. Sometimes I read about a spiritual teacher and I think, he seems like the real deal. It's usually he. He seems like the real deal, Then I found out that he's been sleeping with hundreds of his followers and taking drugs and financially extorting his followers' incomes. So yeah, so this scale could help people to ascertain whether a spiritual teacher is genuine or whether he is a charlatan or not. Great, so that's where I'm up to after 15 years of my research, and I hope that my university will allow me to continue researching this area for many years to come. Thank you.